I'll say it again. Thom Perez, the chair of the DNC, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor, Democrats.org. You can tweet him at Thom Perez. Secretary Perez, Chairman Perez, great to have you back with us.
Oh, please call me Tom. It's always good to be on your show, Tom. And you were talking about Steve Bannon and the citizenship question. As someone who led the Civil Rights Division, the notion that they needed that information for Voting Rights Act enforcement purposes is categorically, I'll say, just false. There was another word I was going to use, but
this is the lie that Wilbur Ross was putting out when, in fact, he was dancing to the tune of the racists and literally, Steve Bannon says use racism. It's a good thing. The racists in the White House. It's pretty mind-boggling.
Absolutely, and right now, as we speak, the person who handled the voting docket when I led the Civil Rights Division is now in the senior leadership of the New York Attorney General's office. And he is the lead lawyer on the case that is in federal court in New York City involving this the illegality of asking the question. And the issue before the Supreme Court, as we speak, is whether they will be allowed to depose Wilbur Ross. Now, it's a high bar that you have to surmount to depose a sitting cabinet secretary. That is the well-settled law. Right. But when you find out that the cabinet secretary has lied, you have surmounted it. And he should absolutely be allowed to be deposed.
But if the Supreme...
We'll find that out within the next week.
Yeah, and if the Supreme Court says, no, you can't depose him, then I think we can infer from that they're also going to say, no, you can't depose the president if you have evidence that he's committed crimes, which is the position that Brett Kavanaugh took in his law review paper that got him, at the top of Donald Trump's list. Do I have that right?
I wouldn't bet against that, Tom.
Yeah,
because, it struck me that his... that theater, and that's the most charitable word I can think of his testimony, that he had an audience of one there, and that audience was Donald Trump.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about voter purges. Greg Palast just literally, yesterday or the day before, just released the list from Nevada of... I don't see 90,000 people just in Las Vegas and Reno and Clark and Washoe counties have been purged from the voting rolls in the last year. He's also got the list on his website at gregpalast.com, and we've had listeners all over the country checking these lists out, particularly the Georgia list, which he's had for about a week, and finding their own names on them and calling into this show outraged. He has the list of the 550,000 voters who were purged in the state of Illinois, and he has the list of the 90,000 voters who were purged in Indiana on his website. What are we doing about this?
Yeah, that's why it's so important for people to plan ahead before they vote. We have a website, iwillvote.com, and we can help with that. We have an 800 number, 833-DEM-VOTE, that we've set up. Don't wait until Election Day to get out there and vote and learn that shenanigans have taken place. One of the ground zeros right now of voter suppression is down in Georgia, where Brian Kemp, whom I sued when I led the Civil Rights Division because he was a practitioner of voter suppression. And
this was years ago. This was like 4 or 5 years ago, right?
Oh, I sued him in like 2011, I think it was. It was. Because you and I have talked about this. You've played the 41-second tape from Paul Weyrich.
Oh, yeah.
They want less people to vote, and that's the key. And what they're trying to do in Georgia, for the benefit of your listeners, they enacted a voter ID law. It was upheld. And so what did progressives do? We made sure that people had their IDs. What else happened? The New Georgia Project, which was a remarkable initiative led by Stacey Abrams, who's going to make history, by the way, in 22 days. She led an effort to register eligible voters in Georgia. They registered over 200,000. And so what did the Republicans do? They enacted a new bar, and now they've enacted a requirement that if it isn't a perfect match between your form of ID and what you have on the voter rolls, then you can't vote. Right. And let me give you an example. If your name is Thomas Perez Jr. and your driver's license says Thomas Perez, Jr., and the voter roll says Thomas Perez Jr., the absence of a comma keeps you disenfranchised. Well, here's what's going on.
And the more common one is this, like my name is Thomas Carl Hartman. So if I said Thomas C. period Hartman in one place and Thomas C. Hartman in another place, that's not a perfect match, according to Brian Kemp, and I would be thrown off the voting rolls. And I lived in Georgia for 13 years, never had a problem voting, but that was back in the 80s. Forgive my interruption. Back to you, sir.
Right. No, but here's the drill. The reason they made this BS up is because the list of voters, and there's 50,000 potentially disenfranchised voters on this list, and 70% of them are African American. And by way of, so you have a benchmark, 30% of voters in Georgia are African American. 70% of voters potentially disenfranchised are African American. This is textbook voter suppression. This is a textbook violation of the Voting Rights Act. This is a violation of the Constitution. This is a violation, frankly, of the motor voter law. And that's why a lawsuit has been filed. And this is just the next chapter of voter suppression, which is why it is so critical for listeners before the election to get online. You can go to I Will Vote. You can call that number I mentioned, 833-DEM-VOTE, and make sure you are registered and make sure that all your stuff is in order, because they're going to try to make it hard. That's their only way to win, because they're wrong on all the issues. And you saw Kemp's outrageous ads in the Republican primary. He wants to make it harder for African Americans and Latinos to vote, and he should resign, quite frankly. It's unconscionable
as Secretary of State.
Secretary of State is able to run for governor. This is, to say this is the fox guarding the hen house is a disservice to all foxes across America.
Well, Chris Kobach just did this in Kansas too. I mean,
exactly.
This is not something new, and it's not just a violation of all these various laws. It's also a violation of basically the principles of small d democracy all the way back to the days of Athens, and just blatantly a violation of that. Now we're talking to Tom Perez, the chair of the DNC. If the 5 Republican appointees, the 5 conservatives on the U.S. Supreme Court, had not chosen to gut the Voting Rights Act, which was renewed by Congress, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 98 to nothing.
Yes.
Yeah, 98 to nothing. There were 2 people didn't vote. And so obviously the will of Congress was there. In fact, they addressed that. They said, people in Congress were afraid to vote against it because they didn't want to be called racists. But we don't care if we're called racist because we don't get reelected. So we're just going to strike this sucker down, or at least a good chunk of it. Had the Supreme Court not gutted the Voting Rights Act, would Georgia have been able to do this?
No, and that's a really good question. Probably one of the 2 or 3 worst days of my tenure in the Obama administration was in 2013 when the Supreme Court, in a case out of Alabama,
Shelby County,
gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act. So what would have happened if the Voting Rights Act were still in place is that the requirements that Georgia is putting in place now to make it harder for African Americans and potentially Latinos to vote would have had to have been pre-cleared by the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department.
Right.
And that pre-clearance requirement was essential because we saw so many actions. Some were not subtle, some were very subtle, but no less unlawful. And that's why Section 5 was such an important bulwark in our voter protection infrastructure. And that's why without it, everybody has to step up. And that's why I've been so actively involved in this. That's why the DNC, through our voter protection program, is so actively involved. And that's why there's so many, Eric Holder's group, so many great lawyers in the private bar, in the civil rights bar. Everybody's actively involved. This is an all-hands-on-deck enterprise. But I'll tell you, the best thing that can happen right now is for people to plan ahead, to make sure they leave nothing to chance. Don't simply show up on Election Day because without having made sure that you are eligible to vote and everything is in order.
Right.
That ounce of prevention is critical because, we have such tremendous opportunity to take back our democracy, Tom, in 22 days. I mean, we could win a dozen governor's races And with the exception of one or two, and I'm talking about governor's races where we're flipping a seat currently held by a Republican into Democratic hands.
Right.
In almost all of those cases, the challenge is the following. They're dead heat races. We have the momentum. We have the better candidate. We're fighting for the issues people care about, whether it's healthcare, education, women's reproductive health, climate, immigration. But you know what? When you have dead heat races and you have this voter suppression going on, and I could talk about North Dakota and what they just did up there. I can talk about Georgia.
Yeah, they just disenfranchised Native Americans. Tom, we just have a minute and a half till we're going to hit a hard break here. I had a caller to my show last Friday. A sweet woman, sounded just like, a nice, progressive, blah-de-blah. And she said, I'm in Texas, and I worked as a voting officer for 20 years. And I can tell you, if you get a provisional ballot, all you have to do is write your name and address on the outside of the envelope. And not only will that ballot be counted, but you will be automatically re-registered in all 50 states. And I'm like, that is complete BS. It's a complete lie. It's not true. Provisional ballots, 95% of the time are never counted. And she continued to insist this. And then I got a bunch of calls and tweets from people saying she had called into Stephanie Miller's show before me and said the exact same thing. There is a campaign by Republicans to convince Democrats that if you get a placebo ballot, if you get one of these provisional ballots that don't get counted, it's just fine. Don't worry about it. And this is what accounts for redshift. This is why, and we've been seeing this since the giant voter purge in Florida in the 2000 election, where Jeb Bush did this to hand the election to his brother, throwing 90,000 African Americans off the vote. People get a provisional ballot, they vote, they think they voted, they tell the exit pollsters, yes, I voted for the Democrats, and suddenly there's a 5-point difference between, what the exit polls show and what the actual polls show. Is there an institutional or a specific program that the Democratic Party is going to put into place to solve this, sir? We have about 20 seconds.
Yeah, voter protection has to be in place in all 50 states. You're absolutely right that if you cast a provisional ballot, it is all too likely not to be accepted. That is why it's important to go to iwillvote.com. Make sure your registration is in order and you can vote. 22 days till the weekend, folks.
There you go. And what was that toll-free number you gave us again?
1-833-DEM-VOTE.
DEM-VOTE.
DEM-VOTE.
Okay, 183. And that's if you have a voting problem or if you just want to know what's going on?
Anything, any questions.
Any questions.
Be safe.
833-DEM-VOTE. Thom Perez, thank you so much, the chair of the DNC.